How's it going, Publius?
Going great, Mod. How are you?
I'm doing well, quite well. Okay, we see people coming in, but I think we can start. Publius, I wanted to start or dedicate some time to today's class and talk about the withdrawal freeze. And starting off, when Beanstalk started, we had a withdrawal freeze of 24 hours, and then in BIP9 that got reduced all the way down to 4 hours. And in that BIP, we discuss or mention that eventually we might want to consider removing the withdrawal freeze completely. And we've briefly discussed this as well, in the past weeks, let's say. I wanted you to, first of all, maybe take us through the rationale behind having the withdrawal freeze to begin with. What kind of friction is caused by it? And then what challenges could we face in implementing a zero withdrawal freeze or no withdrawal freeze at all?
So the original idea for the withdrawal freeze was taken from ESD. And like most of the things that were taken directly from ESD was misguided. So the misguided thought was that having a freeze to withdraw assets from the DAO would prevent inorganic demand, which to some extent it may, but as we spoke about in another class recently, or maybe it was a DAO meeting, that having a withdrawal freeze exacerbates inefficiencies in the market because you have a supply overhang. So if people know that there is supply that's coming in a period of time, that prevents them from buying or discourages buyers. And that can exacerbate sell pressure because there's no buyers from the expectation of sellers because those assets are frozen. So once you realize the opportunity cost associated with burning grown stock, it's reasonable to expect, there's some negative expected value of demand associated with each frozen withdrawal. And so as there are a significant amount of frozen withdrawals accumulating, the attractiveness of buying decreases. And therefore, as much as having a freeze to withdraw assets may prevent people from depositing them because they don't want to deposit them if they can't get them back over a short period of time. And the reality is the withdrawal freeze is probably a net negative. So that's something that's become apparent over time. Now, BIP 9, I think you said it was, lowered the withdrawal freeze from 24 to 4 over time, and did so slowly and steadily. But the question is, well, what is the purpose of the withdrawal freeze at all at this point? And we would make the argument that it probably shouldn't exist. Now, you can't set the withdrawal freeze to 0 because the way silo rewards are currently implemented, somebody could deposit assets, call the sunrise function, and then withdraw assets immediately and collect the seigniorage, and therefore in a risk-free capacity steal, or not really steal, but take some of the bean seigniorage each season. And the concept is that's so there's a lot of things that can be done to Beanstalk to improve the way that the silo rewards are distributed such that that's not possible. Of various levels of sophistication and complexity and economic complexity that are good, better, best on that front. But the concept is, I think at replant, it probably would make sense to lower the withdrawal freeze further, to as low as it can go right now is 1. So that's probably what makes the most amount of sense.
Okay. And just to cover the last bit, what you explained, which is, sandwiching the sunrise function and then getting bean seigniorage without real Beanstalk exposure. Some ways to solve that would be, for example, is to only allow seniors to be distributed an hour after a deposit. Another solution would be not to allow deposits, at T-1 or an hour before the current hour. Could you think of other solutions, or these are probably what we're looking at, or some of the things that we're looking at to bring it to zero?
So those are the most basic ones. Now, probably the most efficient version of that is that the silo rewards from a season accrue over the course of that season over time, such that you can't in a flash loan. You have to take exposure to the bean price over a period of blocks, and then you accrue the seniorage over the course of the full season. That's probably the most efficient way to do it. It's also probably not the easiest way to do it. Other things to consider are maybe spreading out the accrual of the seniorage instead of over the course of that season over multiple seasons, which could potentially make the silo stickier. But then you introduce the problem of people that deposit their assets after the beans have been minted. You can't have people that deposit after the fact have access to the minting. So there's a lot of complexities to do it any way other than the two ways you suggested, which are much simpler.
Okay, and I agree with you. It seems more like the better decision, let's say, is to lower it down to an hour on replant, and then think more about bringing it down from an hour to zero following that or after that. Okay. I wanted to also talk about price oracles and how Beanstalk reads or is going to read the price, I guess the price of bean in the pool, and then the potential of having so right now Beanstalk has no upper maximum on the amount that it can mint per season. What is a scenario, or what's the possibility of having a price oracle attack or the vector of attack that would cause Beanstalk to mint an infinite amount of beans?
Well, there's a lot of different things to be said about the price oracle. The first is that Beanstalk doesn't calculate a price explicitly. Instead, it calculates a delta B, the number of beans that need to be minted or the number of soil that should be minted in order to remove the bean or return the bean price to its peg. And at the end of the day, the delta B calculation is the way it's being done is changing. So originally it was based on Uniswap and compared the bean ETH pool compared to the USDC ETH pool, and did so using a time and a time weighted average. Now, Uniswap v2 didn't naturally support a liquidity weighted average. And so in order to compensate for the ability to flash loan and deposit LP tokens in the silo, the delta B based on the time weighted average was weighted by the liquidity in the silo. And because of the withdrawal freeze, you couldn't deposit things in a flash loan. So in theory, that introduced flash loan resistance to the delta B calculation. So you have a time weighted average, and then you factor in the liquidity such that it's manipulation resistant. Now, going forward, there is no bean ETH pool, and instead there's a bean 3 curve pool. So the delta B calculation is now going to use curve to calculate a time and liquidity weighted average delta B, which there's a couple things to be said about it. Frankly, the oracle assumes that the price of each stable coin underneath 3 curve are each worth $1, which at the moment, as we know, Tether is sitting at a slight discount, and the other two stable coins in the pair are at peg. So the concept is the oracle is probably not perfect. Now, you could make the argument that with Uniswap fees, the delta B calculation on Uniswap as it previously existed wasn't perfect either. But it's just it's not a perfect oracle as it's currently constructed, at least theoretically. Now, the calculation uses the time weighted average of beans and recurve in the pool over the course of the previous season in order to calculate a delta B. And then it also weights the liquidity. I'd have to check actually exactly what it's weighted by. I'd have to refresh my recollection. But I can check on that. Or perhaps Publius can hop up here if either of them recall off the top of their head. But that's the concept of how it currently works. And I think when we talk about generalizing delta B, the main things that need to be factored in, as you were talking about, Maud, is that the amount of beans that can be minted is manipulation resistant. And the key to that is that there's no way to significantly affect the amount of beans that are minted, or really affected at all in a perfect world, without taking exposure to the bean price over a block at least, right? So if you take exposure to the bean price over a block, you expose yourself to being sold against, and therefore there's real price discovery there. So any effective price oracle should not factor in the price during a block, but only factor in the price at the end of each block, which is the way that the curve TWAP works. So at the end of the day, if the goal is to remove manipulation, those are the types of things that are necessary. Now, the other thing that you mentioned is potentially putting in a cap on the delta B, and I think assuming that you have a manipulation-resistant delta B calculation, it wouldn't make sense to introduce a cap on delta B, because then you could run into the scenario where the price is very high and delta B is at its cap, and the fact that delta B isn't increasing fast enough means that the market knows that there's not going to be enough beans minted to return the bean price to $1, and therefore people can front run the minting. So one of the things about the delta B calculation is that it is designed to create an efficient market, because the amount of beans that can be sold or can be sown every season is exactly equivalent to the amount of beans that needed to be bought or sold on average over the previous season. So that you don't want to introduce any inefficiency there, if that makes sense.
Agreed with you. Not being capping the demand or the minting output is an inefficiency in itself. So, if did I understand this correctly? What Beanstalk looks at is the number of tokens that are in the pools, and then it decides, either a ratio or a certain price. That's what it is eventually. So it looks at what are the total number of tokens, and that can't be manipulated. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, it looks at the total number of tokens over the course of the season at the end of each block.
Got it. Okay, so you can't really manipulate. If you want to manipulate it, or there's a point that needs to be manipulated, is the actual number of tokens that are in that pool.
Well, and so that's the question of then how much liquidity there is.
Yes.
In the case of Uniswap, what was done in order to ensure that was manipulation resistant, where people couldn't add liquidity but not deposit it into the silo and then just scale the delta B calculation, is that Beanstalk only factored in the liquidity in the LP tokens in the silo. So again, not sure off the top of my head how the implementation works on the liquidity front for Curve, but it's either going to be a sister implementation to that, or it could be that Curve supports some flash loan resistant liquidity calculation, which it could be. If I'm recalling correctly, I believe what Curve offers is that you can query the last block, the balances in the last block, and therefore you, independent of like the sunrise being called in the current block, the balances that are being used are the balances from the end of the last block. And therefore, that could be, I believe that is resistant to flash loans on the liquidity front. So that may be what is used to calculate liquidity. But again, if Publius is at a mic and wants to hop up and confirm or deny what I'm saying, that may be helpful. Because again, I don't have it in front of me.
Okay. I think this bit is clear, or the general idea of it is clear. Let's compare this now to if Beanstalk in the future used, a price oracle such as like Chainlink or one of those price oracles where someone comes and tells you that this is the price of whatever the asset is. Can that open an attack vector to Beanstalk? Would then Beanstalk fail if that price oracle fails?
So it depends what the dependency on the price oracle is. Now, the reality is if the delta B calculation can be corrupted, it's a question of how much can it be corrupted, right? So if you can manipulate the mint and affect delta B by 1%, that's a fundamentally different thing than if you can manipulate it by 10,000x and you can just change the amount of beans that are minted dramatically. So it depends on what the particular vulnerability to the price oracle is, and that applies to an on-chain oracle or an off-chain price oracle through a centralized party or a semi-decentralized party. Doesn't really matter. Now, the thing about, and it's good to talk about the oracle because I think the oracle is one of the weakest parts of Beanstalk as it's currently implemented at scale, because there is the question of, well, if the price, let's take the Bean ETH Bean 3 curve, the Bean ETH USDC ETH Uniswap model, which is a more decentralized model, or a more a theoretically more pure model than the current Oracle implementation. The issue that you run into is at scale, there's only so much USDC in that pool, and therefore manipulating the price of the USDC ETH pool over the course of a season may actually be not that expensive compared to the yield that you can get from Beans, assuming that Beanstalk is significantly larger, even if you only own a small portion of the stock. So that's where, at scale, I think even the current implementations of the oracles are weak because the other pools that are de facto built on stablecoins that are limited in their supply, right? This is to some extent the problem that Beanstalk is solving. The supply of stablecoins, as the supply of beans grows and grows, the reliance or the ability to manipulate the prices of these other stablecoins and how that affects the pure delta B calculation relative to $1. That's one of the things that I think is imperfect about the current Oracle situation. Now, if you have an outside solution like Chainlink, I don't think that helps you at scale, because the cost of manipulating those validators is probably going to be pretty cheap compared to the yield you can get from Beanstalk, assuming Beanstalk has hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars in value.
Okay, understood. JWW follows up and asks how is using, if I'm not mistaken, they use the last block price and query it against a flash loan or to be flash loan resistant. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on the logic?
Can you repeat that?
JWW is asking how does curve or the flash loan resistant formula that uses the last block's price and how does that work? What's the logic behind it?
Got it. And I see that in the chat for those who are just listening that Publius respond confirm, meaning that everything I've said so far is correct. So good to know that I'm not spouting misinformation. The concept is if you're taking out a flash loan, the dynamics of it are the funds need to be returned at the end of the transaction. And so you're borrowing the funds, you're manipulating something on chain, and then you have to return the funds at the end of the transaction. That transaction is getting mined in a block. And so that transaction is getting processed in a block. And then the concept is at the end of the transaction, even if it's the last transaction in the block, at the end of the transaction, once the flash loan has been repaid and there's no longer any manipulation happening, meaning someone who's not taking on risk, but is having an effect on on the price or something else, that is avoided by using the values at the end of the block itself, because it's not in the middle of a transaction.
Got it. I think Liquidity has, but that's different, I guess, point. But they use a fallback price oracle, and then they measure against the price on the previous block, and if they see like whatever they call is like an off or something that is like weird and change in price, then it compares to the second fallback price oracle. But yeah. Okay. Austin asks, and that's more like a philosophical question. What do you think is the future of Beanstalk Farms' role in the development of Beanstalk? Do you see Beanstalk being developed by one organization that is, as decentralized as possible, or would it be multiple organizations working on Beanstalk?
It's a great question. At the end of the day, there's probably infinite improvements that can be made to Beanstalk. Now, the goal is for Beanstalk to become an issuer of money and to function as a primitive across DeFi, and therefore changing things constantly is not aligned with that. And I think over the short term, it's more likely that people can coexist, contributors can coexist under a single umbrella, meaning that there aren't rival factions with different ideas about where to take Beanstalk at the moment. And therefore, it doesn't really seem like there's any benefit to having multiple decentralized development organizations. Now, one of the, I think it's BFP 80, which lays out a new proposed structure for Beanstalk Farms. I think that's a very cool idea and moves things even more in the direction of permissionless but organized contribution to Beanstalk. And it really makes Beanstalk Farms more of a community than anything else. And again, as long as people are contributors to Beanstalk Farms are aligned about where to take Beanstalk, that it doesn't really make sense to. It seems inefficient to have like parties that are not talking or working on things. Now, at the same time, if you look at the development of various decentralized or semi-decentralized protocols or faux decentralized, at the end of the day, having multiple independent parties all working on the protocol, that is essential to decentralization. So it's not good to just have one person doing one specific thing. It's good to have multiple people that know how to do everything, and don't think that those are exclusive, that you need to have multiple separate organizations at this stage of the game. But it's also very natural that over time, there may start to be different opinions and people want to work on totally separate things, and other organizations pop up. Now, with where Beanstalk is currently at, I think there's, just speaking off the cuff, there's probably still another 6 months to a year of, rapid development that will happen or should happen to the protocol at the base layer. But at some point, most of the changes, should be done, and then, whether it's adding another pool to a whitelist or changing a seed stock and seed ratio, those are non-substantive things that don't really necessarily require continuous work. So it's hard to see that far into the future. Think that in general, in the spirit of decentralization, there's nothing wrong with separate organizations spinning up that are totally independent of Beanstalk Farms. We may even encourage it. Like it's great to do, but it's like it just doesn't seem like it's going to happen over the next immediate future. And it's there's only so many people working on Beanstalk at the moment. It's not 100, so people are still pretty aligned at this point.
Harry Smith asks, any latest updates on the audits? Publius, do you want to answer that?
Sure. So the latest is that both sets of changes, the changes for the Halborn audit and the changes for the Trail of Bits audit, have been sent back to the auditors, and we are awaiting the fixes. There was one change to, I think we're still waiting for some final confirmations from Halborn, and then on Trail of Bits, we're still waiting on the final report there and on the fix report as well. So it's probably, I mean, that is a pretty substantive update that both audit firms are now reviewing the final changes, and we're waiting on their go ahead to proceed.
Okay. Syncubate shares some concerns about Circle and USDC, and asks, what's the plan for Beanstalk upon replant to consider, introducing other pools, and what would these pools be?
Yeah, I think everyone's on the same page about the importance of a Bean ETH pool and adding a Bean ETH pool shortly after replant. Just want to comment that I think the Circle FUD is pretty ridiculous. It's pretty ridiculous. So we'll leave it at that. At the end of the day, the structure of things as it currently stands is a company like Circle, they need to take counterparty risk, meaning the only way to hold that much cash in a riskless fashion is if you can hold it with the Fed. And Circle doesn't have an account with the Fed. So Circle has to have bank accounts with banks that have accounts at the Fed. And there is some counterparty risk associated with those banks. So my understanding of the issues that were highlighted was around what Circle has disclosed on who their banking partners are and where the assets are held in terms of which banking partners hold which assets. And I heard from Jeremy Allaire personally, who's the head of Circle, that they are working as hard as they can to get all of the approvals from their banking partners necessary to publish that stuff. But there's all sorts of rules and laws around this stuff that really determine what they can and can't do. And there's, as far as I see it, they are acting, in the best interest of USDC holders and they're trying to minimize counterparty risk by diversifying their holdings across a variety of banks. And hard to imagine there being significant risk associated with that, given that any of the counterparties that they have are presumably too big to fail in the eyes of the Fed, or certainly would have access to some sort of lender of last resort services, let's call it. I just don't think it's a real risk.
Nevertheless, irrespective of the risk, the Bean ETH pool is probably going to be, the one worked soon after that. JW mentions that Beansprout is an accelerator that helps, other projects along Beanstalk. He kind of asks, maybe that's a follow-up to the same question on how many people are working on Beanstalk Farms, and how do you see Beansprout working along Beanstalk Farms in the next, 6 to 12 months?
So Beansprout, I think to date, in my humble opinion, has been a huge success. Root is a very cool idea. It's an exciting development on top of Beanstalk, and Mr. Manifold has given pretty consistent updates to the DAO, so won't comment on anything about Root specifically, but just think that it's exactly a protocol like Root is exactly what we had in mind, even if not actually had in mind, but what we imagined in an abstract sense at the time Beansprout was created, where it's what are the cool things that can be done on top of Beanstalk? Well, prediction markets and decentralized betting markets. That's one of the most obvious things. So building that on top of the silo is awesome. So what else can be built on top of Beanstalk? Who knows? But the hope is that Beansprout continues to be a place where entrepreneurs and people with ideas that want to do cool things and build cool things on top of Beanstalk can get access to funding for. So whereas Beanstalk Farms, and again, I encourage people to look at maybe not again, but I'd encourage people to look at BFP 80 about how Beanstalk Farms is likely to function going forward, assuming that it passes. It's very clear how that's not really a grant program in any sense. So people that want grants and to work on their own stuff that are Beanstalk related, that will continue to happen through Beanstalk, through Beansprout.
And Harry Smith asks, when is the root public announcement? That's planned for next week. And Mr. Manifold, extends the offer to all entrepreneurs. Come build on top of Beanstalk. Okay, I think we're at the end of the questions. Maybe we'll give it a minute or two if anyone else has, last questions, whether it's a follow-up on what we spoke about or a question that we didn't address. Not sure if that was an actual question, Austin. JWW reminded me of it. When is generalized minting? I believe that's a joke, not an actual question.
Definitely a joke. But, in theory, it is worth saying generalized minting, similar to generalized convert, is a part of Beanstalk as it's been audited. And all that really means is that both convert and the minting, or the calculation of delta B, are now based on a whitelist. So various converts from whitelisted asset A to whitelisted asset B can be whitelisted, and similarly, various pools with functions for a delta B calculation could be added to the total delta B calculation. So both of those are now or will be implemented upon replant.
Terboy asks, when we have a Bean ETH pool, how does Beanstalk perform or Bean perform when the price of ETH goes up or down?
So Beanstalk was originally launched for the Bean ETH pool, so there's a lot of data on this front. And apples to apples, since assuming that 100% of the liquidity the beans trade against is Ethereum, if the Ethereum price changes 1%, then the bean price changes by 1% as well, unless there is market activity. So the short answer is that ETH volatility results in bean volatility, which is very good for converters and does create some additional minting of beans and soil in practice, particularly when the market was smaller. It wasn't the most efficient. Now, Beanstalk, it's unfortunate that Beanstalk wasn't on during the latest ETH drawdown, but Beanstalk has been on during various ETH pumps and overall drawdowns, like 50% or more top to bottom. And I think it was like 2,500 ETH or so at the time of the attack, maybe a little less. So ETH was down pretty significantly already from the peaks, but obviously not down at triple digits yet. So hard to say exactly how Beanstalk would perform, given that there are lots of other factors, but in general, the Bean ETH pool adds to volatility in the bean price.
Krabs sends an encouraging message to the contributors at Beanstalk Farms, and then asks if there's a way for the community to make sure that contributors get compensated in the future.
Yeah, I would actually use this as an opportunity to echo this, and haven't said it in class, but this is a good chance to just say thank you to there have been more than a handful of contributors that over the past month or two have just done some really incredible work to get Beanstalk in a position to God willing, successfully replant and get back up and running. And it's unclear what is fair compensation for all of those people that have been working so hard and tirelessly. And I mean, the amount of work that's been produced is really gargantuan and impressive. And frankly, most of it isn't even yet on display for the community. There's a Git book coming and a disclosure statement, a technical document. I mean, there's so much stuff that's going on to make Beanstalk better, an updated website and new functionality and guides. It's amazing what people have been doing. So not exactly sure, to answer your specific question, Krabs, with that as a preface, what the best way for the community to make sure that those contributors get compensated is at the time. So Beanstalk Farms currently has these unripe beans, which are currently worthless. And at replant will be basically worthless. Now, I think at replant, Beanstalk Farms, or shortly after replant, my understanding is that it's the intention of Beanstalk Farms to propose Q3 budget BIP to fund contribution to Beanstalk Farms going forward with newly minted beans. But there's also these unripe beans, which, to some extent function as like vesting interest, because right now they're worthless, but over time they'll become worth, hopefully, beans. And to me, that's a great way to offer long-term aligned, rewards to these contributors. And there's a lot of unripe beans to go around. So, and not that many contributors that, in our opinion, are entitled to significant amounts of them. So, and we certainly don't like to get involved in allocating of stuff like that between contributors and don't like to play the middleman in any way. So hopefully with the new structure of Beanstalk Farms, members of Beanstalk Farms will figure that out. We in our capacity as Publius won't have to get involved at all. But one way or another, one thing we will get involved in is making sure that those contributors are well compensated. So hopefully don't have to weigh in there. But if some people that have done really amazing work aren't getting fairly compensated by the DAO, we'll be sure to raise our voice. So that's one thing that we can do to make sure that those contributors are well compensated. And appreciate you, Krabs, for shouting them out as well.
And a lot of the Beanstalk Farms structure and proposal and touches a bit on these ideas are in BFP 80. So I encourage everyone to go or read it and share your thoughts and opinions about it. Okay, I think we're at the end of the questions for today's class. Publius, thank you very much for your time, and see you in the next class.
Thanks, Mod.